What's up, fellow psychonauts? Oops. There we go. How we doing this week? Well, it's about to get a lot better because I cooked up something good just for you. Psychedelics are incredible tools that help illuminate life's greatest mystery. No, not consciousness. No, not the soul. Gender. Today I will be discussing the gendering of psychedelics, as well as how gender plays into the broader psychedelic community. Firstly, I just want to note that I am not a gender expert. I identify with what I was assigned at birth, at least for now, and this video is by no means intended to be an exhaustive or thorough discussion on the subject. I just want to further the conversation within the psychedelic community, you know? So to get started, let's first attempt to define what the heck a gender even is. Part 1. Gender. What is? According to Western conservative tradition, gender is the biological sex of a person, which can only be male or female, and is determined by examining visible secondary sex characteristics, ZPP, and making assumptions about chromosomes as if the average bear has ever even seen their own karyotype before. From this perspective, because you can only exist as either A or B, intersex people are often left entirely out of the conversation and are privately forced into publicly presenting as one of the two options provided. Following this mode of interpreting gender, we see that within so-called Western society, roles are typically assigned to each of the two genders. This is where societal expectations like men are breadwinners, women are homemakers come from. Philosophically, this binary division has taken more ideological forms as well, such as the belief that men equal order and logic, while women equal nature and chaos. Jordan Peterson. This tends to impose all sorts of harmful assumptions and restrictions on individuals existing under that societal framework, such as men being taught that crying is weak, or women being taught that their appearance is their greatest asset, among many, many other things. However, this view is a political one that does not accurately or ethically reflect the reality of the human gender experience. There is no one characteristic that determines a person's gender, nor is there an established threshold of attributes that will make you one version of a human over another. Everyone has estrogen and testosterone, no matter what their chromosomes are. Men wear dresses and women have mustaches, etc., etc. The growing contemporary perspective on gender is that it is a phenomenon that can be informed by, but is not determined by, biological sex, and that it is primarily socially constructed, as stated by the World Health Organization. Transgender people have a different gender than what was assigned to them at birth. This could be a transition from one binary identity to another, or it could be more ambiguous, or a third gender, or agender, or non-binary, among many other identities. I see this as a beautiful and necessary societal development that should be embraced, as trans acceptance greatly reduces harm to the community. I need to add that this idea of gender not being a rigid binary is not new. Many cultures in the past and present have different interpretations of gender. For example, indigenous nations of Turtle Island have the term two-spirit to identify people who fulfill a traditional third gender in their cultures. Though the term is an English summation, as the concept exists in many diverse varieties across separate cultures. To summarize all of that, gender is a non-dual emergent phenomenon from psychological and physical cluster properties that are both socially and individually defined, to put it simply. Got it?
Okay.
Good. Let's move on to the next section. Part 2. The gender of psychedelics. It's common to see different psychedelic substances described with gender terms. In the case of salvia and datura, for example, users often report experiencing a feminine otherly presence, the shepherdess and Queen Tallahassee, respectively. I see a lot of commonality between them as they are both referred to as imperious. However, the different psychopharmacological reactions change their characteristics. For example, the shepherdess is sometimes seen as a guardian and teacher when salvia leaves are chewed, yet violently cruel when potent extracts are smoked. Whereas Queen Tallahassee is formed of tricks tricks, as datura is considered a deliriant and activates in different regions of the brain. Also, ayahuasca is commonly referred to as Mother Ayahuasca and is seen as a motherly teacher as well. As a side note, in my shepherdess archetype video, someone commented pointing out that I did not acknowledge that the feminine essence of Salvia divinorum very well could have existed before colonization. I find this probable, although I don't believe that the archetype could have taken a form of a shepherdess, as sheep were imported by Euro conquistadors. Therefore, it would have likely taken an alternate form that was culturally relevant. Moving on, Father Peyote and San Pedro represent the more masculine side of this phenomenon. However, they both have the same psychoactive chemical, mescaline. Make of that what you will. As far as I've seen, other psychedelics such as psilocybin mushrooms, iboga, and morning glories are not associated with any particular gender, and relatively newer synthesized substances such as LSD and DMT have the gendered nicknames Lucy and Dimitri, though I feel like these names aren't intended to assign genders to these specific substances. But where did these gender associations come from? While there is no concrete answer to this question, I think a number of factors come into play. Factors that could lead to a psychedelic experience feeling gendered could be communicated through an individual's interpretation of visionary signifiers. Things such as gendered clothing, voice pitch or tone, as well as overall vibe or omnipresence. Another factor that plays into the gendering of a psychedelic experience or substance is cultural tradition and general social hearsay. As many who assume the gender of the psychedelic are at times relaying an assumption that came from somewhere else. These preconceptions can also be brought into the trip from the user's subconscious, and therefore inform the experience. This gendering of psychedelic visionary experiences is not determined by its metaphysical chromosomes or cosmic reproductive organs. Like I said before, these gender distinctions emerge from cluster properties and are distinguished individually and socially. I think the fact that we can assign genders to psychedelics is further evidence that gender is separate from sex. I believe the truth is that no psychedelic is rigidly gendered, as even substances like salvia that has been assigned feminine, many users have described masculine presences in their trips as well. Though his thought is now outdated, Carl Jung's concept of the anima and animus, meaning masculine in the feminine and feminine in the masculine, I find is similar to these experiences. And I happen to agree with the Redditors that claim that salvia is actually genderless. And that's about all I have to say about the gender of psychedelics for now. On to the next section. Part 3. Gender roles in psychedelic spaces. For as long as recorded history, there have been many indigenous matriarchal cultures, and the high role of the doctor or shaman is commonly held by people of any gender. Maria Sabina is likely the most well-known female shaman, famous for passing along knowledge of psilocybin mushrooms and Salvia divinorum to white Westerners. While here in so-called Western societies, the role of political leaders, doctors, and scientists are predominantly men, as we live in a patriarchal society. There are theories that suggest that psychedelics and psychedelic-type rituals play a role in allowing for a more gender-equal culture. While there are often psychedelic rituals in matriarchal and less sexist societies, I'm not sure if I agree because there's not a strong enough correlation for me between psychedelic experiences and the disruption of gender bias. In the 1960s, during the hippie movement, the summer of love and all that, there was an attempt by settlers to return to the land and convert to a style of living that was closer to indigenous ways of life pre-colonization. They were, of course, known as the dropouts, as they were dropping out of the current toxic Western capitalist culture. However, these dropout communes were plagued with the conditioned Western ideologies of patriarchy, further corrupting their appropriation of indigenous culture. It is my belief that because dropout culture did not unite with other counterculture movements at the time, such as AIM, it enabled the destruction of these movements, and the dropouts were mostly absorbed back into capitalism and resumed their positions within the corporate machine. Some kicking and screaming, others happily frolicking through Silicon Valley. Throughout the 80s and 90s, Terence McKenna propagated the idea that Western culture was in the process of what he called an archaic revival, arguing that male-dominant Western culture was being dissolved by a return to indigenous ways of life, stating that things like tattooing, rave dance, and of course, tripping balls are all examples of this cultural occurrence, as well as what he referred to as the feminization of Western civilization.
Psychedelics, I count as a feminizing force because they introduce you to the unconscious.
Nowadays, the biggest figures in online psychedelic spaces fight to uphold the Western tradition of patriarchy, and their fans would probably call me a cuck for saying that. Most notably, Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson.
It's like the men organize themselves, and there are influential men that rise to the top, and the women take them.
When you're talking about postmodernists and their rejection of these classic male structures, or what they're doing is realizing that they're not going to compete in the classic, as stated, male hierarchy, so they're creating their own version of it.
Mm-hmm. Sure, that's the creative element. Sure, well, we asked earlier, what's the motivation of these pathological guys who are out there, like, bolstering up the feminists? Yeah, well, you know...
They don't compete any other way.
They don't compete. They figured out how to compete. They compete as allies, let's say. Very sneaky.
Peterson characterizes the archetype of the feminine as chaotic and an opposite of the masculine, which represents order, which is just sexist on the face of it. As in his philosophy, order good, chaos bad. And everything can obviously be lumped neatly into those two categories.
Masculine. Why? Well, that's the patriarchy. Chaos. Feminine. Why? Well, partly it's conceived of in opposition to the patriarchy. There's always a social structure that's half tyrannical and half order producing. And there's always the nature that gives rise to everything and that destroys it at the same time. Always. It's permanent.
He even titled his book Antidote to Chaos, for fuck's sake. Self-help for who? Because as I've said before, gender is a fuck, as in an emergent phenomenon from qualitative cluster properties, and there is no set amount of properties that will define you as presenting one gender over another. In other words, these archetypes assigned to genders are false correlations. As I talked about before in my video on the origins of the word psychonaut, Ernst Jünger was a proponent of perpetual war and a triumph over pain and suffering as a means to achieve manhood. However, I believe that philosophies like these are mechanisms for coping with the violently traumatic history of humanity and global colonization. I find it super hypocritical for these right-wingers to argue that manhood needs to be achieved or that it is more manly to be alpha when they are also arguing that there are only two genders and that it isn't a spectrum. So which is it? Is it that there are only two genders, or that an individual can be less or more of a man or woman? Because these are contradictory arguments. There is a long history of degendering leftist movements as a way to discount their positions, such as these pieces of anti-suffrage propaganda from the early 20th century. The feminizing of men and the masculinization of women was intended to dehumanize political opponents, and argues that to be not a man or woman is to be less human. This rhetoric is perpetuated to this day with right-wing insults like cuck, beta, and soy boy. Hey, but there is some hope for our future as the accepted definition of gender is transitioning to encompass the wider spectrum of human gender experiences, as it is increasingly common for institutions to recognize the greater gender spectrum, unlike YouTube analytics. Concurrently, the eruption of femboys on social media, I think, would bring a tear to Terrence McKenna's eye. Wait, that's just my social media?
Just unfortunate that I have the body I do. I'm actually a lesbian trapped in a man's body.
As for whether psychedelics aid in a person's journey of gender exploration, while I don't think psychedelics inherently do one thing or another, they are tools that can help explore an individual's identity and experience. And articles such as this one by Double Blind suggest that it can help with people's gender exploration, acceptance, and even ease gender dysphoria. Truthfully, I am unsure if psychedelics alone can help to feminize and rid the world of its toxically masculine attributes. However, if it is a tool that helps the greater society in that transition of living a more healthy and egalitarian existence, then we could use any asset we can get our hands on, as the male-dominant patriarchy of capitalism eminently threatens to destroy any possibility of future human societies. For a final thought, I wanted to state that to be a psychonaut is to explore your own consciousness, and that psychedelics are just one way that we can do that. If you like to research drug trip reports, enjoy the avant-garde, experiment sexually, explore your gender, even if you just watch my YouTube videos, you are a psychonaut in my eyes, and I am proud of you for being here, staying alive, and exploring the unknown with me. Much love.